and in China. And earlier this year, I had the opportunity to coordinate an effort we call a progressive, principled, pragmatic approach toward China policy. And if you haven't already read that report, we'll go ahead and share a link in the comments section. But it represents CAP's thinking on the priority issues that we need to address in our relationship with China. And it's based on the input from dozens of experts from Washington and around the country. And repeatedly through that report, the technology competition comes up as really at the heart of the friction between the United States and China now and in the coming years. So there's just a ton of stuff to cover, and we have some really remarkable experts as we go about that. First of all, I'm really pleased to be joined today by Emily Kilcrease. Before joining CNAS as a senior fellow and director of the Energy, Economics, and Security Program there, she was Deputy Assistant U.S. Trade Representative for Foreign Investment Policy. In that role, Emily coordinated USTR's work on CFIUS, the Committee for Foreign Investment in the United States, and on policy issues related to national security, export controls, and supply chain. Before that, she worked on those issues and others at the National Security Council and the Department of Commerce and Interior. And I was particularly pleased to have Emily join CAP as we drafted the tech section in our recent report that I just mentioned. Finally, for those of you who leave this conversation wanting to hear more from Emily, I really encourage you to find her podcast, De-Risky Business. It is a really great exploration of some of the economic and tech issues in the U.S.-China relationship. Emily, welcome. And I'm also pleased to be joined by my colleague at CAP, Adam Connor, Vice President for Technology Policy. Adam has spent the last 15 years working at the intersection of technology, politics, policy, and elections as the first Washington, D.C. employee for tiny Silicon Valley companies like Facebook, Slack, and Google. Oh, no, I'm sorry, Brunei. Before that, he worked on the Hill and on John Kerry's 2004 presidential campaign and was a fellow at Harvard University, where he focused on the rise of technology companies and their effect on politics and democracy. Adam, welcome. We could spend an entire program on that last topic, just given what's happened the last week or so on that stuff. But we have a great audience online, so my hope is this conversation among the three of us, but also with the folks who are in the audience. And so with that, let's jump right in. First of all, Emily, 20 years ago, if I can start, maybe talk about where we are and how we got here. 20 years ago, people routinely said that autocracies, including China, simply incapable of innovation. Today, many of those same people are saying that we're hopelessly behind China. So how did we get here? To what extent is China's seeming progress as an innovation economy real? And to what extent is that progress the result of market forces, government policy, IT theft, or something else?
Yeah, thanks, David. Before I answer, I just want to say thanks to you and Adam and CAP for leading such great work in this area. It's so important that we get China tech policy right. So really happy to contribute to the effort here. But in terms of how did we got here, is China beating us? Are we beating China? You know, what has changed over the last 20, 30, 40 years? I think the first thing I would emphasize is that China has benefited enormously from a rules-based trading system, from globalization, from having connection with the rest of the global economy. They're not a traditional kind of autarkic autocracy that rolls off the tongue very well. You know, they really have had this mixed system with heavy state intervention mixed with bringing in and connecting to the global economy where it suits their purposes, right? I think you see that particularly strongly in how they welcome in foreign investment in their tech sectors, also combine that with strong state support, and then combine that with a side helping of a little bit of IP theft and forced tech transfer. And you put all of that together, and that's how we get to where we are today. It does still take US policymakers by surprise when we have a big Chinese tech company make it big. We're still grappling, for example, with the emergence of TikTok in the US and its a massive popularity. We're still figuring out what to do about Huawei and 5G. So I think that's a good indication that we need to take China's tech advances quite seriously. We need to have the policy and legal frameworks in place to kind of take the protective measures that we need to. And then I hope we'll spend a bit of time on this today, and I'm sure we will because it was part of our paper, but how do we think about proactive measures for the US to stay ahead? How do we make those investments in our own domestic tech ecosystem to make sure that we're not just playing defense on these things?
Adam, I'd be curious on your thoughts on that, and particularly, Emily, you talked about TikTok and Huawei. Adam, I mean, how real is U.S.-China competition? Sort of, what's the next TikTok? What's the next Huawei? And more generally, the Chinese companies that have become household names here in the United States, and more generally, what sorts of technologies should we be thinking about, both from an economic security, but also a national security perspective, that are going to be the challenges coming down the road?
I think thanks, Dave, and thank you, Emily. Really excited to be here today. I want to touch a little bit on Emily's last point as we go to this question, which is really, and I think you see this throughout the paper, and you'll see this throughout our conversation today, which is kind of the phrase competition. And I think what is interesting about the U.S.-China competition in the tech sector is it is multifaceted, and I think it touches a lot of both domestic and global context. So, I'd say kind of three things here, which is one, competition in the U.S., particularly for big tech companies, is something they've been a little unfamiliar with for the last decade. You've seen kind of this rise of several large companies and, kind of the stifling of domestic innovation. And so to some extent, competition from China and others is something that they're still kind of trying to wrap their heads around, because some of them went through a period where they weren't really experiencing that. And so I think about this in a couple of ways. One is, I came in the commercial tech sector in the Web 2.0 era, primarily the software and Web 2.0 era, social networking and large kind of social networks and tech companies. And you see, kind of two things there. One, from a competition point of view, that really started to kind of coalesce in the last decade, and you see kind of fewer successful breakout startups. I think my former company Slack is a good example of, even in the business SaaS space, where we thought we could have some standalone companies, having to compete against some of the tech giants meant eventually they had to be purchased by Salesforce, even though, they kind of wanted to remain independent. So you get a domestic kind of stasis here, and then you add into it, I think, what's kind of a unique approach or kind of sector perspective in the tech sector for China. So for the big tech companies in particular that have had kind of a physical presence, right, in the world. So if they're doing advanced manufacturing, obviously Apple's had strong ties to China, because of that. If you think about Amazon and the kind of physical goods they need to move into our borders, they've often had a very understanding kind of a broader approach to this. But if you look at the kind of digital only platforms like Facebook and others, when I was in the kind of tech sector at the kind of beginning of the century and into the tens, that was really a time where it was becoming clear that efforts to get into the Chinese market weren't, going to happen in that kind of realm, or weren't worth the trade-offs, or they were being kicked out. And so you kind of get this interesting perspective where some of those companies kind of didn't have to think about China as competitor for a little while on kind of their core services, right? They were focused on monetizing the rest of the world, and kind of understanding that was a world outside of it. And so when you see something like TikTok, kind of take folks by surprise domestically, part of that is because they candidly hadn't thought there would be competition coming in a little while. And I think in particular, TikTok is such an interesting point of view because they kind of, we'll talk about the kind of recipe for success for TikTok was, kind of grow and refine its product within the Chinese borders, kind of protected from some of the US companies, kind of perfect it, and then come with a boatload of cash, because the only way to penetrate some of these kind of moats that tech companies have right now, in particular, kind of getting installs on the two mobile OSs, was to buy a ton of advertising from Facebook in particular, Google. TikTok was among the largest advertisers. They tried to build up their ability to penetrate the market because it was very difficult to do so as well. So, you know, one of the things that I think is an important kind of caveat to TikTok is TikTok is a rise that really only comes from being kind of in China, and we're not sure it can be replicated in the future, which is, I think, dangerous on that aspect to say we draw too many conclusions from TikTok. But I think as we look at AI, where I think we'll spend most of our conversation today, you know, I think that's a very different question as people are, you know, thinking about this. And I know Emily and others will talk about some of the chip restrictions and other things, but I'll just say, you know, having been in Silicon Valley, you know, in the kind of height of the Web 2 era, you know, necessity is really the driver of innovation, even as much as competition is, right? And so I think, as we note in the report, restrictions on advanced technology and chips and other things like that, that's not going to last forever. And you know, there's a great Wall Street Journal article a couple months ago saying China's pouring a ton of effort into figuring out how to build next generation models with slower chips or be more efficient or push it to the edge. And so, you know, that is a competition. That is a thing that is going to kind of keep growing. You know, even with some of the measures that we've seen undertaken or are likely to see undertaken in future administrations.
So, Adam, let me follow up on that because you talked about TikTok, its breakthrough into the U.S., sort of unexpected breakthrough, and I would sort of lump in maybe two other Chinese on the sort of web-based side of things. You have Temu or my kids laugh at me when I try to pronounce it, and Shein. You know, so you have these three really important breakthroughs, but you also have then the TikTok ban. You've got talks of ending the de minimis exception that which allows small shipments into the United States, and getting rid of that would really endanger both Temu and Shein's business models. So, you know, the three breakthroughs in those technologies, in that part of technology, has been a U.S., I don't know if you want to call it allergic response or immune response. Is that what we can expect in that as we see sort of Chinese companies emerge on the U.S. market?
You know, I'll defer to Emily, who might, I think, probably have a better sense of the Temu Shein de minimis kind of business model, for lack of a better term, and its viability. I think certainly a business built on a trade, you know, kind of exemption is one that's precarious from the start. And so I will say that I think Emily might have more to add there. I will just say on TikTok, you know, the space for it that I think sometimes we underestimate is that U.S. tech companies had every advantage to create something like TikTok. They had the network, they had the money, they had the monopolies, and you know, you see that lack of competition, meaning they got beat, even though the barriers were pretty high for TikTok to get in. And so I think when I talk about competition, obviously we are focusing primarily on the U.S. China piece, but I think there's a lot of us that have argued that there's this kind of back and forth debate on competition domestically, and the question is, you know, are steps that maybe antitrust enforcers or others takes to increase competition domestically damaging national champions we need to compete against China? And I think part of the argument against that and why domestic competition is good is that both one, that's been the traditional life cycle of innovation in the United States, right? We've had new companies come up and dethrone old ones. So when I was at Facebook at one point, we moved into our new headquarters, which was the former headquarters of Sun Microsystems, which has been a huge company in the previous web boom and then had, you know, kind of fallen behind. And you kind of see less of that. And so I think that competition edge, and I think the TikTok example to me is, if we were protecting national champions who brought forth their own version of TikTok and succeeded wildly, we'd feel good about their competitive edge. I'm worried about the stasis there kind of domestically and that implication in our broader competition when it comes to that.
Emily, thoughts? And one of my reactions is it would be a mistake to just think about U.S. China tech competition in the TikTok, you know, the sort of internet realm. So what else is out there that sort of is the next big technology coming down the pike that's going to be in the crosshairs of U.S. China frictions?
Yeah, and I also want to weigh in on this question of the U.S. policy community's allergic response to any Chinese companies making it big in the U.S., because I think that's a very good way to characterize it, Dave. whether it's, trying to react with de minimis or trying to react with a CFIUS case or whatever it is, I think the way you can connect the dots across those cases is that there is this unexpected emergence of a major Chinese tech player, whether it's a software-based e-commerce provider or whether it's in actual manufacturing of hard goods. And then policymakers just grab for whatever tool is available to them to try to stem the perceived economic or security harms. And so I think that's the common thread between them. Whether it's de minimis or something else, I think is a separate question. I think you also see this came up quite clearly in some of the controversy in the clean energy space, which has been a huge priority for this administration, but a lot of pushback to things like Goshen investment in Michigan, to any sort of partnership between U.S. and Chinese clean energy manufacturers, which puts U.S. clean energy manufacturers in sort of a difficult spot, given that China is a leading producer of these technologies. And there's this lack of clarity on how we think about de-risking alongside and potentially in tension with other goals like the climate transition, right? So I think that's a big, tangled knot that we haven't totally figured out how to unweave here yet. But to your actual question, which is how do we think about technologies outside of some of the apps and outside of TikTok? I'm perfectly happy not to talk about TikTok anymore because that's gotten so much airtime and ink's spilled on it already. But the thing I always come back to, and this is where I spend a lot of my work, is chips, right? Where there's a clear security argument to make sure that the United States has that manufacturing capacity. The United States does have the design and innovation leadership there. People forget that part. But if you can't manufacture the chip at the end of the day, how much good does that do you, right? So I think when we get into some of these advanced manufacturing, you can look at robotics. And then, I would also put clean energy in there as well. Like there's this whole manufacturing capacity aspect of things where China does have an advantage in some respects. And the US is trying to figure out how to, in essence, reindustrialize parts of these key supply chains in the United States, whether it's for an economic argument or, from where I sit at CNAS, it's much more often the security argument. We can't not have a reliable supply of chips. That's just a straight up security issue.
So, but we have the CHIPS Act, right? And so can we kind of brush our hands together and say, well, we got that done, thank goodness, or is there more to do on semiconductors? Maybe Emily and then Adam will.
Yeah, we're definitely not done. I mean, so the CHIPS Act was a really good idea. We needed to make that intervention in chips markets because otherwise there was simply no commercial way that the major chip manufacturers could viably bring production back to the United States. It just wouldn't make commercial sense. And manufacturing chips is a really cutthroat thing to do commercially. And particularly when you think about things like memory chips, the margins are incredibly thin on those. So the economics just didn't make sense. Now, will the economics make more sense with the CHIPS Act investments? They'll make a little bit more sense, right? I think it's encouraging that at this point, we've seen the announcements come out of the CHIPS Program Office at the Department of Commerce, where they're putting investments into the three leading manufacturers of chips, so Intel, Samsung, and TSMC, of course. They're looking at memory. They're looking at some specific military components. They're really trying to spread these investments out across the chips value chain. Now, that money hasn't been spent. The chips aren't coming off of these new plants yet, right? So still a little TBD to see whether those investments will be sufficient. And that's all happening against the context of the US not being the only country that's trying to make these sorts of investments. China is also making massive investments, it's trying to catch up. But the thing that people often forget about, it's not just the advanced chips that we're worried about. It's also the legacy chips. Those are the things that go into everything, right? This is the chip that's there's a bunch in our computers, there's probably a bunch in your car, there's probably one in your coffee maker. China's building a lot of capacity there. We need those chips just as much, if not more, as we need the advanced chips. And so we need to think about that full value chain to make sure that when we're thinking about investments, how to make this commercially viable in the United States, we're thinking about all of that. And it's the legacy chip piece that I think Chips and Science Act is we're just not going to be able to get there because the economics on that are so hard.
Well, and I would just add one small thing. I think we tend to talk about this in the context of China, future conflict and kind of the trade aspect. But, I think COVID was a really good reminder that economic shocks aren't just from, kind of human events, right? They're also from, the unknown, from pandemics or others. And I think that legacy chip shortage is a really good example of kind of bringing forth to policymakers and the American public why it was important to start to think about that. Those shortages were very real and they impacted all sorts of things at a pretty precarious time. And I think, luckily we kind of hopefully have the opportunity and started to learn from that. But, I think I think that brought home, not just in chips, obviously, but a number of kind of brittle places where it turns out there's both no give. And if everybody wants something at the same time and we don't have any domestic capacity, it really has a tremendous economic impact on us as well.
So, Adam, it's interesting. Thinking back to the distant past when there was a chip shortage, right? Because, if you've read Chris Miller's Chip War book, the number of Chinese fabs coming on, semiconductor plants coming on that will be producing those legacy chips is pretty eye-popping. And Emily, you talked about the challenge of the economics of legacy chips as they are today. It's hard for me to understand how it makes any economic sense for anyone, or will in the near future anyway, given how much capacity is coming on that we know of. And as you say, Emily, there are lots of other countries thinking about jumping into the game. So where do we go? What does that mean for U.S. chip makers and I guess the chip industry more generally?
Yeah, I would say there's two things on this. One is, how do we use all of our policy levers in tandem to tackle this problem? I mean, we've been talking about the investments. That will be a piece of it. Obviously, when you're looking at advanced chips, there's a whole other set of actions being taken related to export controls, related to outbound investment, that's really trying to slow China's advances in that space. You can also look at some of our trade tools, the tariff tools. One of the sectors that was identified in the most recent 301 update from the Biden administration was legacy chips. Now, it's massively complicated to think about how to effectively use the tariff tool on a good like a semiconductor, which of course, like, we're not importing semiconductors directly from China, we're importing them in the context of a final good, right? So I think there's going to be some learning there in terms of how to use the trade tools to protect or to kind of get ahead of an anticipated flood of Chinese legacy chip production. But I do think it's encouraging that we're looking at how to use these tools in tandem in a much more strategic way, because that's the only way that the government really can, like, essentially shock global supply chains into a different shape. It's a massive endeavor. We have to use all the tools at our disposal. The second major line of effort, and this is one where the Biden team has been really focused, is of course not looking at this just from the US perspective. Like, we're not the only ones with chip capacity, and particularly when you talk about manufacturing, like, what we really care about is secure supply. That can come from the US. It doesn't have to come only from the US, right? And so I think there's been a real effort, again, a lot of work to do, but a real effort to work with Japan, to work with South Korea, to think about how do we genuinely friendshore and make sure that we're all kind of raising the tide here when it comes to chip production, chip innovation, et cetera. So I think it has to be those two things in tandem to tackle this problem. It's how do we use all of these policy levers together to kind of get to that end outcome that we want, and how do we think about the roles of some of our key allies in a real genuine friendshoring effort.
And Dave, I'll say I absolutely, to everything Emily said, and certainly, in the report, we focus on progressive, principled, pragmatic, kind of recommendations. I think if we take former President Trump both seriously and literally, which I think is sometimes something that is not always done with what he says, and his kind of promises on really massively increasing tariffs on every imported good, like, that is probably not I would argue a thoughtful use of deploying every tool in a positive way, but it scrambles things in a way I'm candidly not even sure I fully understand, and maybe, but that our thoughts and Emily's, that's in an administration that might have a vested interest in kind of building on this kind of principled policy, but in a kind of pragmatic way, and I think certainly a polite way to describe maybe what former President Trump has said about his tariff policy and plans is it's a much more, I think at best we can say a new approach, right? It certainly would be just a dramatic shift, and it would really, I'm not quite sure what it does to some of the economic thoughts to it, and and the domestic concerns of others. So that is a very real kind of question that we'll kind of know after the election is over, certainly, but it's certainly something that you can really see branching paths there.
But maybe if I can pick up on that, Adam, we know what the first Trump administration did. And now, I mean, I don't want to talk about the Biden administration in the past tense, but it's, we're a couple of months out from the elections. So, I mean, how did the Trump and Biden approaches differ? I mean, were they, would you say, largely different, largely consistent with some differences at the margins? And, then we can talk about what a Harris or a Trump 2 might look like.
I'll defer to Emily to start on that one.
Yeah, I mean, I do think there's been, a decent amount of continuity, candidly, between the first Trump administration and the Biden administration in some areas. So when you're looking at export controls, for example, and you think about some of the novel tools that the Biden team has used, like foreign direct product rules to assert extraterritorial control over chips made anywhere in the world if they're using U.S. tooling, which all chips do, right? That was an innovation, a policy innovation that came up during the Trump administration, and then the Biden team expanded it, right? And so I think there's been just a continuation on the protect side of things to a great extent, and an expansion under the Biden team of some of those measures. Now, there's an asterisk to all of that, which I think is that the Biden team is trying to be very targeted, very tailored and proportionate. They, I think, have a little bit more concern about unintended consequences of some of these measures. And the notable distinction, going back to what we were saying about partners and allies, is that they really have put a lot of time and effort into trying to secure the diplomatic cooperation of other key countries. So I think that's where we've seen a little bit of differentiation. When you look at the tariff tools, I think it's largely similar. Like the Trump team started that conversation with the 301, the Biden team kept those tariffs and then expanded them. But it expanded them in their own way, which was to not do across-the-board tariffs. We're not talking about kind of a massive effort. They were looking really strategically at key industries where they thought that tariffs could have a protective benefit to complement the domestic investments that they were making in some of these key technology areas. So there's a lot of continuity, but I do think, in terms of a lot of the tactics and how they approach this and who they're working with, and kind of their concern about the unintended consequences, that's where I see some of the real distinctions between what we've seen under the Biden administration and what we saw in Trump 1.0.
Adam, I would say there's a very real possibility that the next president will pick up the phone, call Cap and say, I need advice on what to do on tech policy. I won't say which candidate might do it, but do you have advice for the next president? Sort of, we now have been in this much more contentious relationship for the last 2 administrations, and where do we go from here?
That's a great question, and I think I would think about this in 2 ways, and we talk a little bit about this in the report as well, right? Which is there's our strategic engagement as we think about the U.S. and China, and also kind of where we have what I would say is probably a shortfall domestically, right? And in some of our tech policy, some of which we have remedied through investments like chips and science and other pieces. But I think where you see a gap that's really difficult right now is our domestic tech regulation is pretty far behind the rest of the world, particularly when it comes to privacy, which is one of the things that was such a friction point in the TikTok debate. It wasn't that the TikTok debate was only about data privacy and security, but it was a pretty large component of it. And that kind of lack of a federal privacy law really is, I think, a vulnerability. We've seen the Biden administration try and eat around the edges of some of it. So certainly the recent EO, around, preventing the sale of bulk data from sensitive categories to certain foreign adversary nations and companies, things like that. But, that gap, I think, remains. And I think having to advance both of those is, I think, pretty substantive for the long term here. I think the one, certainly our lack of privacy laws and other things have just been a real kind of deterrent in our conversations with Europe and other countries that are like-minded allies as we try and forge, kind of broader consensus. So I think, the goals on the tech side that the Harris administration outlined, I think remain fairly bipartisan and fairly important. Things like privacy legislation, child safety legislation domestically, more increased antitrust. Those are kind of things that I think, as we've noted before, also help us on the kind of global stage. Certainly, for instance, Vice President Harris has been a leader on AI for the Biden administration. She, led our delegation to London in the AI Safety Summit last October. And so I think one of the interesting opportunities, and I think it is probably important to say here that one of the things that happened in the last 6 or 8 weeks with Joe Biden choosing not to run for re-election is that no matter what happens in January, there will be a new administration. There will be a turnover that won't be the kind of, if Joe Biden had won and been reelected, you would have expected kind of a more linear continuity. And even if Vice President Harris wins and chooses to keep some people around or not, it's a kind of much more of a substantive break or transition to a new entity than we've seen. So I think the conversations a lot of us might have been having earlier in the year about what alternatives look like are a little different now. Obviously, both candidates have a different policy approach on a number of issues, but we will see that kind of new administration, new people, new policy resets kind of have that opportunity to come in no matter who wins. And I think certainly, for instance, if Vice President Harris wins, you see things like the kind of into the first term work that the Biden administration has done by executive action. So the artificial intelligence executive order that was issued in October of 2023, almost all of the things it called for finish up a calendar year later. So basically by the end of October this year for the most part. And so there's a real open question about whether what the second Biden term had been or what a Vice President Harris may choose to do on, say, artificial intelligence, which is something that obviously both has significant domestic and concerns international work we're doing, not just with our allies, but as we talk to China and others at these safety summits. So I think it's a very open play. I'd say certainly the kind of opportunities there will continue to compete and cooperate as the paper puts out. And I think there's a really interesting space there for a second AI executive order, one that maybe tackles some more binding pieces. If you look at the first AIEO, it only had a few things that really kind of got set into regulation or practice. Most of the things were advisory or OMB or other things. And so we did a paper in June with Governing for Impact that really outlined 88 things an administration can do using existing executive authorities and statutory authorities among a variety of agencies to take action in AI. That would certainly be something I'd put at the top of the list.
So let's follow up on AI, because probably like most of the audience, I wake up in a cold sweat most mornings with visions of killer robots and it's sort of a total loss of personal privacy. Where do we go on AI? And particularly, I mean, the U.S. and China are the two AI superpowers, to paraphrase Kai-Fu Lee. Is there real? I mean, it would seem that there is a reason to cooperate with China, but is there a real prospect that we would be able to do so on cooperating to manage the risks of AI? Emily, thoughts?
I think we have to attempt it, right? I think the risks associated with AI are real and genuine. And even with the systems as they exist today, which are far from perfect, and for folks who follow this, they know that sometimes these models tell you to do like wacky things like put rocks on your pizza or eat glue, right? Like they're not perfect yet. But they are really powerful, and they're going to continue to get powerful. And so I think it would be irresponsible not to make the effort to have some level of coordination with China about how to manage safety and security around these sorts of systems. Just like we have to talk to people we don't like around like nuclear arms, which is a difficult task and it doesn't always bear fruit, but I do think we have to make the effort. Having said that, I think we need to calibrate expectations about how much we're going to be able to influence China's own development of these systems. And so the track with China can't be the only track, right? I think it's imperative that we're working closely with other leaders like the UK, like Europe, who are really trying to put some guardrails around these sorts of really powerful AI frontier systems. And then we develop our own domestic approach. I mean, kind of keying off what Adam was just saying around privacy, where the US has been a laggard. If we don't come up with a US approach that kind of strikes the right balance for our US security interests, our democratic values, our economic interest, somebody else around the world will. And I would much rather have us figure out how to do this and how to collaborate internationally than do what is often the case in tech regulation, which is just to follow Europe's lead, or the companies end up following Europe's lead because they're the ones that do the regulation and they end up being the global standard setter. So it's really hard to overstate the importance of the US really trying to get ahead of this. Now, the the caveat and the asterisk to all of this, of course, is that AI is also the space where we're using the export control tools really, really aggressively. So when you look at a lot of the rules that have been rolled out, it's really around the AI chips and the tooling to make those AI chips. So that will certainly complicate things with China, but it may complicate conversations with Europe as well. I think there's increasing signs that we're getting more alignment on those sorts of controls with the Dutch and the Europeans. But that's takes a lot of political capital, and hopefully we can kind of pursue those two tracks in tandem, where we're doing that protect side of the agenda around the chips specifically, but not losing sight of those broader objectives around the need to really have serious conversations with partners on safety and security.
So, go ahead, Adam. Sorry.
No, I think I agree, and we see that not just in the tech space, the climate space, or others, where this is an interconnected world, and that kind of shared problem. I would say, if you read, say, Project 2025 or some of the other kind of political positioning out there on the campaigns, it was certainly harder to engage in that conversation in a kind of less nuanced space. And so I think certainly, or less interest, candidly, I think from the Trump campaign. And so I think certainly that some of that hinges on how one chooses to approach China generally, and not just in the specifics of AI in the global context.
Yeah, can I add on that briefly? I mean, I do think that's an important distinction, right? Like, we haven't quite gone down fully, the Trump 2.0 versus Harris approach on these things. But when you look at the possibility of something like 60% tariffs on China and 10% across the board tariffs, like, that's just going to suck all the political energy out of these negotiating rooms, right? And so I do think when you think about the China channel, like, if they're negotiating over 60% tariffs, like, I think the chances of being able to do anything real on AI safety and security, which were already slim, are going to get even slimmer. And then for the Europeans, if we're talking about 10% tariffs there, I think what we've seen in the past is that they really chafe at having to negotiate with the US with something like that hanging over their head. So there may be, I'm not going to speak for the Trump campaign here, obviously, like, there may be reasons that they want to proceed with that sort of approach, but I do think we need to recognize that there's real complications that causes for our objectives elsewhere in the relationship with partners and allies.
So before we leave AI and AI policy, Emily, you seemed skeptical. Are we able to get our stuff together and put together U.S. AI regulation, and does that need to be legislation? Can it be executive branch, or are we likely just to fall back and have the Europeans do it for us?
Well, I like to be an optimist, so I think we can do it, right? And I think we've seen some progress. I think even the voluntary commitments from big companies that the White House coordinated, that's a good step forward, right? So I think I think we can do it. I think AI really has gripped the imagination of a lot of folks in the U.S. policy community. I think that's a good thing. The fact that it's kind of weird and quirky and terrifying all at once, I think, has made people pay attention to it. So I am optimistic that the work can proceed. We've got good initiatives at NIST around this. So hopefully we can do better in this space than we've done in some other tech areas.
So we've got a ton of good questions from the audience. I do want to ask one. We've sort of danced around chips and the IRA, the big U.S. investments in I would say the offensive side of a tech policy, which is the industrial policy, putting money into building up the U.S. tech base. I wonder, are those sorts of investments a good idea, whether or not China is out there competing with us, or is it just a good idea because we have the challenge coming from China? Adam, maybe I'll start with you on that one, and Emily, if you've got thoughts.
I think that particularly when we think about IRA, chips and science, and some of the landmark initiatives that the Biden administration and Congress, the 170th Congress, pushed through, I think those were kind of in response not just to our U.S. China competition, although it's certainly central to some of that, but to the global issue of climate change, and thinking about what we need to do. Let's not forget the bipartisan infrastructure bill as well, which was literally just a response to decades of underinvestment in essential infrastructure, which is something we've been falling behind kind of globally as well. My sense is two parts here, which is one, that there are aspects that would certainly make sense even absence of U.S. China kind of competition. Again, the climate change aspect, it remains very concrete there to help jumpstart the markets and make sure that we are able to kind of continue to live on this planet. And I think the other is COVID, right? I think the aspects here for what a kind of economy with no resilience is something that we really felt in a kind of non kind of human conflict way in a COVID. And I think hopefully that taught, I think, plenty of policymakers a lessons too about economic resilience. So my sense is that industrial policy in that sense would make a kind of sense because of the kind of large scale problems. Like certainly the kind of growing competition made it a lot easier to combine some of those arguments with a kind of more traditional frame.
Yeah, I would agree with all of that. I would just add maybe 2 points. One is, on chips in particular, obviously geography plays a big role in why folks are concerned there, but also it's extreme concentration. When you think about the possibility of, for example, an earthquake in Taiwan, that could take out half of the global chip production capacity, like that is just a risk that we should be worried about. And so I think that is completely separate from the China-related risk. Having said that, though, I think particularly on chips, the China angle did give it more of a bipartisan flair. That's not nothing these days. And so I think we do need to be thinking about how to build like genuine political consensus around some of these investments. They're incredibly important for our economic and our security interests moving forward. I'm glad they both did move forward, or all three of those big initiatives move forward. The question is just how to sustain it and make sure that these investments actually achieve what they're intended to achieve.
So Emily, you talked about the risk of an earthquake in Taiwan, and let me get to the first of the viewer questions that are out there. It's not just an earthquake, and I'm going to date myself by, back in the 1980s, they talked about the most valuable piece of real estate was in downtown Tokyo by the Imperial Palace, where it, just billions of dollars for a chunk of land. But now it would have to be that the Hsinchu Industrial Park in Taiwan, where you have just a really microscopic piece of land globally, sort of the vast majority or the great majority of the really advanced AI chips are built by TSMC. And it's not just an earthquake we have to worry about. What are the risks to the United States and globally to that concentration? And what do we do about it? Has chips fixed that? Will it fix it in the coming future? And what do we do about the vulnerabilities given the tensions between the United States and China over Taiwan?
A large question. We should have a separate seminar just on all of that. In terms of risk to global supply chain, there's a lot, right? I think we're learning lessons, right? So it's not just earthquake, it's obviously anything related to kind of China aggression, which does not just mean an invasion, right? Like, I think if you look at military exercises, you look at increased coercion in the Taiwan Straits, at a certain level, that can and would have an impact on trade in and off the islands, full short of like an actual like embargo or invasion scenario. So I think that's something we should be worried about. It's one company, right? And so it's that concentration aspect that I think is concerning. It's an amazing company. They like completely revolutionized how the chip industry works. They make amazing chips, right? But it is still one company. And so we should think about that. But, kind of going back to the question of, has the CHIPS Act solved this? I think it's making a good incremental step forward to address that range of risks. We need to make sure that that money gets spent well, that there's the effective government oversight that the CHIPS Program Office is set to give to these investments to make sure that they're really providing those benefits for U.S. security interests and U.S. taxpayers. But even if that is perfectly implemented, I think we need to recognize that the U.S. is not going to be able to completely mitigate risk in chip supply chains by itself. And that's where I, again, come back to the need to work with some of our key partners like Japan, like South Korea, like Taiwan, to make sure that we're doing everything we can together to make sure we're mitigating those sorts of risks globally.
Can we talk gardening? Small yard, high fence? I don't know if we use that analogy anymore, but it is come to characterize how the U.S. at least wants to think about technology competition with China. And I guess maybe I'll start with you, Adam. Is that possible? The risks of small yard high fence is that the yard tends to get bigger, and the bigger your yard is, the harder it is to keep a tall fence. So are we, where do we go with that? Is that the right way to think about security, technology competition with China?
I think it's a very reasonable way to, I think in following with some of the, kind of things that we've said and outlined in our paper, progressive, principled, pragmatic, and other pieces there. I think it is, we certainly stand at the possibility of a real, as we used to call it in the industry, sorry, we call it in the industry, like an A/B test here, right, on approaches, right? And so, I think that is not how you might describe some of the rhetoric coming out of the Trump campaign on China, for instance, and other pieces. So I think, to me, it seems like the best option is to try and to, kind of adapt as we go and hold on to these principles. But, I think, not to bring it back to this, but I think, we are just very rarely, and I don't mean this in any sort of partisan way, are we presented with such kind of stark potential contrasts on approaches, that an administration might take. And obviously we've talked a little bit about what happened to the first Trump administration, but, we see a lot of signs that the kind of lessons learned from the Trump administration were not double down on the parts that we saw a lot of continuity into the Biden administration, right? It's the kind of jettisoning of the constraints that let them, that kept them from doing some of the things that I think President Trump in particular wanted to do. So, my sense there is it certainly is a more reasonable approach than others we might see try. But I think Emily, I know, certainly was in the Financial Times for some of the pieces recently, talking about this. So I'll kick to her.
Yeah, I do think the gardening metaphor, though much abused, and I say that as somebody who loves gardening, I think it does have value in that it reflects this idea that there's a core set of technologies that are really essential to, like, what I'm calling now our hard power interests, right? Like stuff that could be used against the United States on a battlefield in a future conflict with China, right? That's what that is really intended to get at. And we're using all the policy tools at our disposal to make sure that we're maintaining as large a lead as possible there, right? So I do think that framing is helpful because it tells us that, like, this should only be a small set of technologies. I think the reason it's, kind of getting debated a little bit more now is that it feels incomplete. Like, think about everything we've been talking about on this call when you're thinking about clean energy and climate transition. Like, there's this whole other bucket of stuff that I've started to think about more as like resiliency interests, where like it's not quite the same as like something that's going to shoot at an American soldier on a battlefield, right? But it's still really important. And the US government does have a legitimate policy interest in trying to nudge markets in a particular way there. So how do we think about that set of policy interventions and that set of policy tools? It should feel a little bit different, right? And so I think this is the conversation that we're all trying to push forward now to get some more clarity around what technologies go in that small yard. And then what are the other technologies that we think are still really important for US interests, but maybe don't need that super high fence, and it's a different set of policy interventions that are most useful to kind of ensure US leadership there.
So I can't let go of fence height. And I think Gina Raimondo would, she was out last year out in Beijing, and, the day she was out there, Huawei rolled out its new chip. So are we confident in the height of our fences, our ability to fence off the technologies that are really important?
I think it's a work in progress, right? I mean, Gina Raimondo has also been very clear she needs a bigger budget for BIS, and Congress isn't giving it to her. We have a bureaucracy for things like export controls and economic security that was created during the Cold War and hasn't seen a budget increase since then. Like, that's not fit for purpose at this point, right? And so I think if we really do want to pursue this strategy, we need to resource the government to effectively enforce this stuff. We also need to make sure we've got people in those agencies whose job is to evaluate the effectiveness, right? Like, I think there's a lot of capacity building that still needs to happen to make sure that that fence is as strong and as high as it possibly can be. Because the worst thing is a high fence with a lot of holes in it.
Right.
It's a high fence measured in nanomillimeters.
That's right.
There you go. So that's technologies that have clear national security implications. But then, Emily, I think both of you actually have talked about clean energy, EVs. We've had the Biden administration announced 100% tariffs on EVs. You've got the executive order on connected vehicles. I mean, where does that come into a national or economic security strategy? The things that don't seem to be sort of hard national security. Adam, is that still a legitimate target of U.S. policy?
It's not my specialty, so I will certainly kind of maybe defer to others on that, except to say that in the event, for instance, of a second Trump term, I think it will be very interesting to watch his administration's approach to EVs, contrary to their position in Trump 1. I think contrary to Elon Musk's pretty significant financial support and China conflicts. And so I think that just adds an interesting dimension that certainly I will be paying attention to if President Trump wins the election and becomes president.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, all of these actions are trying to deal with like slightly different flavors of like economic or economic security issues, right? So connected vehicles, that's all about making sure that all of the components that go into cars on US roads don't serve as surveillance machines, right? I mean, so that's a security interest. It's a little different than, tech transfer issue, which is how we think about the export controls, which is different than like just making sure that we have a vibrant US auto industry, right? So I think this just kind of goes to prove my earlier point is that like we have a lot of different policy objectives that we're trying to pursue right now. We need to think in a much more nuanced way about what tool to use where.
Let's another question from the audience on immigration and how that fits into American tech policy. I mean, how important is I would just say, functional immigration policy or approach to overall American tech objectives? I know Emily, the report talked about that, so maybe I'll kick that to you first.
Yeah, I mean, it's incredibly important, right? Like we're talking about industries that are global, expertise that is global, and we want to make sure that we're attracting the best and the brightest to come work in the US and stay in the US to drive our industries forward. We can't do that without a working immigration system. I think, almost every report you read on tech competitiveness will have a recommendation in there about immigration because it is so essential. So we need to fix the immigration piece. We need to fix our own domestic pipeline piece. There's a STEM education piece, right? But like the workforce component of all of this tech competition is incredibly important. And I don't think we've fully solved that yet, although, they're trying to address that even in CHIPS Act, they're trying to make sure that there's a workforce component associated with these investments, right? But it's a massive problem. It's a national problem. And we don't fix it without some sort of immigration reform.
Absolutely.
So there are a couple of questions on biotech. I know neither one of you is a biotech expert, but this week is China Week in the House, and the one piece of legislation that seems likeliest to get support is the Biosecure Act. And I wonder if either one of you have thoughts on what that means for the really deeply integrated U.S. China market in pharmaceuticals.
Yeah. I mean, without opining on the Biosecure Act specifically, I do think it's worth noting that biotech is one of the tech areas where we need to be cautious about the guardrails we put up. Like there probably is a case for some sort of guardrails, but we also need to make sure we're not precluding benefiting from any investments or innovations that are being made in the China market. I got asked this question once before the U.S. China Economic and Security Commission of, is there any advanced tech that you'd want to import from China? And my off the cuff response was like, well, if they cure cancer, I'd sure like the US to benefit from that, right? And so I do think we need to, in biotech in particular, I think we need to be quite careful to make sure we're leaving open enough areas for collaboration while addressing things like personal health information and obviously bioweapons. Like there's some obvious stuff that we need to keep an eye on. But I would caution us against clamping down too much in the biotech space.
So I have one more question from the audience, and then I'm going to give, because we only have a few minutes left, I'm going to give each of you a chance to sort of talk about the thing that you wish had come up but didn't. But I'm going to reveal my age again with my question, which is, back in the 1970s, in the oil shock, one of the responses in the United States was the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, and to give the U.S. government a little more flexibility to respond to shortages and fluctuations in the global oil market, to essentially make us less vulnerable. as we proceed down the road towards the energy transition, we have now a fairly functional SPR, but we have nothing similar on the other minerals that will play a key role in the energy transition. So, is there thoughts on whether I'm first of all whether my take on that is right, and second of all, what do we do? Because putting together a reserve like that takes money and consensus and support here in the United States. So what do we do with that, or do we just leave that to the market?
I'm not quite sure I understood the question, Dave. I just want to make sure I'm answering it.
Yeah. So I mean, is there a room for a strategic gallium reserve or strategic lithium reserve in the United States, or is that really something best left to the markets?
I will just say two things. One, I'm not sure how much you've seen the kind of amazing cartoon that goes viral on Twitter every couple of months, which is like critical mineral resource dependent on our entire future shortage of random farmer in Midwestern state in America discovers largest quantity of said thing ever emitted, cycle repeats. And so, I think certainly there's a question there of how some of these prioritizations go. I think some of this is just about what has been discovered, not so necessarily what it was out there. I don't have a strong answer on that, except to say I think the other lesson I pay some attention to from this administration is their very innovative approach to the petroleum reserve and buying and selling at times that have both replenished and made a lot of money off of it. And so, I think there is generally room for innovation within this. I think to the critical mineral part, I'm not quite sure.
Yeah, I would just add quickly on that. I mean, I think there's some other things we can be thinking about as well. Like part of it is we do R&D and investments in technologies that don't rely as heavily on the minerals that China dominates, right? So there's a technology innovation piece of it. There's, again, a partners and allies piece of it. Like, can we be working more with Canada on lithium? Can we be working more with Australia on some of their reserves? As a former diplomat, Dave, maybe you'll appreciate we need to have a much stronger game in Latin America. So there's that whole global alliance piece of things as well. Like, it may be difficult for the US to make this stuff or produce it or process it domestically, but that doesn't mean that some of our partners and allies aren't. How do we use, for example, tariff tools to give those sorts of imports preferential treatment from Australia? Like there's a lot of kind of clever thinking that I think we could do to kind of build that critical minerals club to chip away at some of the Chinese dominance here.
So Emily, there was a lot of things came up, but a lot of things didn't come up. What didn't come up that you wish had, and I'll leave it open-ended for you.
Yeah, I'll do it's a little bit of a cop out, but I think it's important, which is that I think the US needs an economic security strategy and a technology competition strategy. Because what we were talking about today, like these are such complicated issues. You need the government, you need the private sector, you need partners and allies, and you need all of these policy tools being pulled in different ways for each technology sector. That's incredibly hard. We don't have a strategy that tells us exactly how we should do that, although you can kind of like glean it from various speeches from Jake Sullivan and Gina Raimondo. But I do think if we're serious about this, we need the strategy, and the strategy needs the budget and the bureaucratic resources to actually implement and enforce it.
Adam?
I think two things, one of which I just wanted to kind of illustrate, which is I think we in the think tank land and other lands think about this kind of strategic Chinese competition, between our countries. And certainly we know for both legitimate and I think ruthlessly pragmatic business reasons, a lot of the leadership in tech companies, certainly thinking a lot about it. I wouldn't say all of the opposition, for instance, all of the support for banning TikTok came solely from a patriotic place from some of the companies that were supporting the ban. But I think it is important sometimes we talk about this competition as if it was a one-to-one refresh of the Cold War. And from my time in industry, during the Cold War, my sense, and I grew up in Los Alamos, New Mexico, so I have a certain sense of this relative to others, was like that conflict in the Cold War was a real driving factor in a lot of both commercial enterprise and the private sector. And, from my time in Silicon Valley, and I think this has been a real point over and over again, that's not particularly how the rank and file thinks about how we do innovation or why we do this, and it's like maybe a little bit is penetrated on IP theft and worrying about kind of security and other pieces, but that competition with China is not driving many sectors of the innovation economy, whether or not it should or well, certainly in chips and some of the other kind of pieces that's different. But I think what is interesting here is we've not seen necessarily the same kind of level of understanding of that as a motivation, both economically and commercially, as I think others might want us to, or might kind of be most useful to the analog of what we've seen in the past. So I think that's a thing I keep in mind sometimes as we have this discussion, is to think about that, particularly for some of the tech industries that aren't maybe as directly associated with manufacturing in particular, and advanced manufacturing. And then I think the other thing I'll just say is, and we mentioned this in the report, about the need to make sure our domestic house is in order on this. There was a special competitive studies report a couple of years ago that had a piece that really jumped out about, they were arguing for, some privacy legislation, some guardrails around AI, and the kind of one of the risks they noted is like, without some of those guidelines or guardrails or laws that have people trust these new technologies domestically, there'll be something that people don't want to trust, don't want to use, and that hampers the adoption as well. So like one of the ways we could fall behind, we will hear some people argue regulation can only hamper innovation, right? One of the ways we can see the US falling behind is the public having an increasingly growing distrust in automated systems and AI and these things that are happening behind the scenes, into kind of no fee, kind of confidence that there's any sort of kind of thing that provides any protections there. And so I think that is another piece here. If we want to be competitive, we will need adoption. And there is a natural human skepticism here that has to be overcome among us here in the United States that I think is important to think about in terms of that.
Well, Adam, I think we'll leave it at that. The importance of the human in the loop and the human at the center of technologies. But thank you so much, Adam Connor and Emily Kilcrease, and thanks to all of you in the audience who joined. Again, the report is in a link to the report's in the comments section, and one more plug for De-Risky Business. And we thank you all, and have a good Monday.
Thank you.
Thanks.